We're entering an era in which our enemies can make it look like anyone is saying anything at any point in time. This is a dangerous time. Moving forward, we need to be more vigilant with what we trust from the internet. That's a time when we need to rely on trusted news sources.
AI technologies are going to transform our lives, health, politics, shopping, and it's also going to change our informational environment. Journalists are already adapting. They're already using some brilliant tools to help them be more efficient, to be more connected to audiences, to understand how they can fit into this new environmental ecosystem. But it means investing hugely, not just in the technology, but in understanding it, having the skill sets, but also then thinking about what value can these technologies bring? How can we balance, the dangers, for example, of algorithmic bias with the opportunities to, personalize news, to be much more creative in the way that we format information so that everyone can get the kind of news information that they need. When the radio came along at the beginning of the 20th century, some people talked about a utopia because we could listen to people around the world. Surely there'd be no other wars. And then, of course, along come the Nazis and Goebbels, who uses radio for extraordinary racist hate speech. And I think there's a similar thing here, that artificial intelligence, these new digital technologies enable the spread of misinformation in extraordinarily clever ways. We're seeing with deepfake videos that you will not be able to trust what you see. That presents a huge challenge, partly because of the scale and rapidity that those programs can work, but mainly because it's kind of invisible. How can you tell what signal will there be that this has been generated by these programs? And then, of course, how do we judge whether they are true? At the same time, though, these technologies do enable, they have algorithms that are identifiable. We'll be able to use similar technologies to filter out and to identify those kind of misinformation. And I also think that they offer opportunities for us to find the kind of information that we need and that is credible in much more efficient and sophisticated ways. But it takes a lot of effort, and I think journalists are going to be critical here. We're seeing how Google and Facebook are now hiring hundreds of journalists because journalists are actually quite good at those difficult human ethical judgments you have to make between whether something is true or false or how biased it is. If we get genuine artificial intelligence at scale, that is going to transform what we understand by information and the way that facts and opinions travel. And we're already getting used to the idea that with machine learning and automation, everything is speeding up. The news cycle is becoming more rapid, and there are a lot of people out there, governments, corporations, lobby groups, individuals, who are deliberately using this technology to either misinform or to lie or to spread hate speech and division. The important thing is, how do you make a judgment about that? At the moment, or in the past, in the analog past, you could look at material communication like television, video, newspapers, and make a judgment about where it came from. And then in that sense, you could hold those people accountable. But when you don't know the source, when you can't control its spread, then you come up with some really tough questions about how far do you want to go, for example, to regulate or control this communication, or do you want to try and let it go free and let a kind of information marketplace happen that sorts out the good from the bad? We have to remember that these big tech companies are all very different. They all do different things. They provide perhaps social networks or search or video or apps and devices that we use. So there is no blanket policy or solution. We're going through a phase where those tech companies are becoming more transparent and accountable, but we are in a sense in a new place. These are not like the old media companies. And so government and society is struggling to work out even what it wants from these companies. Do we want freedom to have full and frank debate, or do we want a much more constrained, careful, controlled forums? So I think that there's a whole series of very painful ethical issues and political decisions to be made, and we should not leave those to these huge companies who are based in Silicon Valley. They're there for profit, which is not a bad thing in itself. They're generating fantastic resources for humankind. But I think it's really important that we don't leave these decisions to them alone. I'm a journalist by profession, and I have an instinctive hostility to the idea of government interfering in political communications and news and the way that we talk to each other. And these new technologies have given us quite an unprecedented opportunity for much more democratic, open discourse between ourselves and across the world. So I think we should tread very carefully before we start constraining what they do. Some lessons can be taken from history. We've seen in the past how you can have a balancing act. You can have ideally a mixed ecology of public sector media, private sector media. And I think we hope that something similar will emerge. But I think we have to take it carefully. So, we proposed, we had a Truth, Trust and Technology Commission here at the LSE that proposed a novel form of regulation which would start off much more as a way of making these platforms more transparent, finding out first of all what are they actually doing, doing vital research to see what is the relationship between those algorithms and the impact they have on individuals, communities and societies. And I think that way, through a sort of a mutual process combining perhaps more old-fashioned regulation, for example, around hate speech, with a more digitally literate kind of oversight that tries to understand what's going on before it starts telling people what to do. There is a huge danger that we could be throwing out the benefits that the internet and social media has brought. There are loads and loads of authoritarian regimes around the world who would love to what they call regulate social media. And what they mean is control that. What concerns me about algorithmic bias is not the bias in itself. I think we've always had points of views and opinions. There's nothing wrong with that. That's what democracy, it's what human life is all about. But what worries me is when the actual way that we communicate has a bias in itself. And bias can mean all sorts of things. It can be that there is a bias around gender or ethnicity. It can also be that there's a bias, for example, towards numbers, statistics, and we don't privilege emotions and feelings or empathy, for example. Especially when you look at social networks like Facebook and YouTube, who in a sense use algorithms deliberately to influence how you behave when you communicate. They want you to be more engaged. They want you to share. And that can lead to a tendency to promote sensationalism, extremism. So we need to know more about that, especially when we're getting vital information, like our news, on those platforms. However, I do think it's important that we shouldn't blame these algorithms or these networks and platforms, or even the news media, for things like political polarization or hostility and conflict. These things also have real-world roots. Media may be a pathway for political polarization, but it doesn't necessarily start it, and it's not always the easiest way to stop it.